Honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen and friends, good evening and dobro večer. My name's Olga Stanojlovic. I'm chairwoman of the Serbian Council of Great Britain, and it's my honour and privilege to welcome you to the 11th annual memorial service for women in foreign medical missions in Serbia during the Great War, and the presentation of the portrait of Dr. Elsie Inglis to the Embassy of the Republic of Serbia. The event is part of Serbian Month, now in its 17th year, and recognised as one of the most significant festivals of Serbian arts and culture in the Serbian diaspora. This year's event is particularly special for several reasons. Firstly, because it's the first time the Serbian Council is delivering the event in association with the Embassy of the Republic of Serbia, which means that Serbia and British Serbs have joined together to remember and celebrate the contribution of the remarkable women who went to Serbia in its greatest hour of need. Secondly, because we have some very special people in the audience this evening. We're privileged to have the Bishop with us, and also 10 relatives of the extraordinary Dr. Inglis, including the Reverend Hugh Inglis Maddox, her great-nephew, and his sister Alison Gopel, her great-niece. I'm delighted that they have an opportunity to see the high regard in which she is remembered by British Serbs and the Serbian people. We also have Michael Shepherd, a relative of another remarkable woman, the Honourable Mrs. Evelina Haverfield, joining us. And with us this evening, we have several authors who have written about this period. Louise Miller, Wendy Moore, Liz Middleton, Jason Ubich, and Sarah Patterson from the Imperial War Museum, and the group of Scottish women who visited Serbia in 2023 to visit the sites of the Scottish Women's Hospital and the graves of those who died there. Welcome to you all, and can I say how honoured we are to have you join us this evening. For those who are able to, I wondered if you'd just stand up so we can see you and we can show our appreciation of what you've done. I think the warmth of that applause shows how much we value your presence here. I'd now like to ask His Excellency the Ambassador, Mr. Goran Aleksic, and Mrs. Fiona Garwood, leader of the group of women who went to Serbia in 2023, to sign the agreement to formalise the presentation of the portrait to the Embassy. I believe it's really fitting that the portrait has been presented to the Embassy, because a copy of the portrait was presented to the British Ambassador in Belgrade on the 15th of September 2023 at the annual memorial service to commemorate Dr. Inglis and the women of the Scottish Women's Hospital at the Memorial Drinking Fountain in Mladenovac, erected in 1915 when Elsie was still alive, to show the thanks that the Serbian people felt for her, for what she and the women of the Scottish Women's Hospitals had done. The portrait, which is just behind the Ambassador, was digitally produced by an art student, Andrea Bogdanovic, who volunteers at the Red Cross of Kragujevac. And the Red Cross in Kragujevac every 14th of February commemorate and honour the 3 women who are buried in the cemetery in Kragujevac, Dr. Elizabeth Ross, Mabel Dearmer, and Lorna Ferris. So, to sign the agreement, I think.
special occasion, and I'm thrilled that so many of Elsie and his family are here. There's one person who isn't here. Huge apologies from the Lord Provost of Edinburgh. Unfortunately, his plane was cancelled this afternoon. Otherwise, he would have been here, and he sends huge apologies. The other person who's not here is a great-great-nephew, Tony Waterston. Now, Tony was going to come with his kilt and his bagpipes, and I'm really sorry, and so is he, that he can't be here. I want to refer just for a few minutes to Alan Cumming, who I know a number of the family will know, and other people. In 2006, now that's quite a long time ago, nearly 20 years ago, this Scotsman went to Serbia for a football match, as one of the teams were playing in Belgrade. Now, he never went to the football match. He paid for his fare, his accommodation, his ticket. Now, why didn't he go? Because he found out there in Belgrade things all about Elsie Inglis. And that was a complete surprise to him, even though he's a Scotsman. When he came back from Belgrade, he then researched a lot, and he made videos, YouTube documentaries, and I think he made links with the family. In 2017, he accompanied the family to go out to Serbia, to Belgrade, and to visit the sites around there. I'm sorry that he's not here and able to be here, but I think we'd all like to pay a big tribute to him, because I think he was a moving spirit before other people knew all about Elsie Inglis. And so I just wanted to mention that, and just to say that we're thinking of it.
It's now my pleasure to ask Hugh Inglis Maddox, the great nephew of Dr. Elsie Inglis, to share a few anecdotes about her that he heard from his grandmother. Now, Hugh has travelled from Dorset, and I have to tell you that he's done this against the wishes of some of his family who were worried it might be too much for him. However, in the true spirit of his great aunt, who refused to sit still, he said, if Elsie, ill as she was, could dress in her uniform and see everyone off the ship in Newcastle just 2 days before she died, surely I can travel from Wareham. And so it's good to see that Elsie's spirit lives on. So I'd like you to share your anecdotes with us.
Yes, Dr. Elsie was the sister of our grandmother. This is Shaw McLaren, married to an Edinburgh surgeon. And my sister Alison and I often heard my mother speak of her aunt, because my mother and her younger sister Eva, when they were small girls, lived with Dr. Elsie at her home in Walker Street in Edinburgh. And so that was a very close link. And I believe that Aunt Elsie used to say that after a very taxing day in the surgery or people's homes, it was so restoring to lay on the floor with little children. And that she did have that playful, gentle side. But sadly, I think that had to be laid aside in all the responsibilities of war, that it was there. And when I was a boy going up to bed, I would open the great cedarwood chest on the landing, and there on the top I could see the faded blue and white ribbon of the star of the white eagle, and I held it in my hand with great awe. And when I was with other relatives in Serbia 8 years ago, we went to the commemoration at the well, and there was a choir of small girls, and I read to them a letter which Aunt Elsie had written to our mother. And Aunt Elsie had said, Amy darling, I hope you're happy and enjoying your new school. This is a lovely country and the people are so kind. When the war is over, I want to bring you here for a holiday.
Oh.
Of course, that never happened. And then, age now 13, our mother often spoke of being at Elsie's funeral, standing on the steps as the choir of St. Giles thundered out the Hallelujah chorus, and the tiny coffin was carried down the steps to a gun carriage pulled by 6 great black horses with a packed Parliament Square and the streets lined 8 deep. And as she went through the poorer parts where her practice had been, mothers would hold up their little children and say, "This was the doctor that saved your life."
Mm.
May she rest in peace and rise in glory. Amen.
Amen. I would now like to ask His Excellency, the Ambassador, to make a small presentation to Hugh and Alison of Scarves in the Spirit of Serbia. And can I just take this opportunity, I forgot to welcome the Ambassador for Her Excellency from the Macedonian Ambassador. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you, Hugh, for those insights. I mean, I think that really meant a lot to us to hear that. Thank you.
Hugh?
Thank you very much.
So on we go to the actual memorial service. I'm so pleased that Fiona mentioned Alan Cumming because he did so much to renew the interest in Dr. Inglis and the Scottish Women's Hospital. And the other person that's really done this for the British Serbian community is Zvezdana Popovic. And she single-handedly, for 11 years, started the practice of holding memorial services for women in foreign medical missions in Serbia during the Great War. I think the British Serbian community really do owe a debt of gratitude to Zvezdana for all that she's done. And I know that Elsie would have been proud of you, Zvezdana. So I'm going to hand over to Zvezdana for some opening comments.
Thank you very much. Good evening and dobro večer svima. Since 2014, we have been organizing commemorations for women in foreign medical missions who were in Serbia and other related fronts during the Great War. The first event, 11 years ago, What Did You Do in the Great War, Grandma, took place at Kensington Central Library and here at the Embassy. My main guest was Liz Miller, the author of her fine brother, The Life of Captain Flora Sands. We were honored to greet Flora Sands' great nephew, Ben Johnson, and Evelina Haverfield's great granddaughter, Sandy Wilson. This year, we also have an event here at the Embassy and at North Kensington Library tomorrow, after the service and Zalušnice in Serbian Orthodox Church St. Sava. And we are so happy to greet our Scottish friends and Dr. Elsie, who is descendants. There are so many stories waiting to be told, to be shared in future commemorations. And I would like to ask my friend, Maya Bachuk, to tell us more. Maya is a Serbian-British actress and has been supporting my history events for years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Svetlana. Good evening, everybody. Well, the real life stories of these brave women are more astonishing than fiction. According to Hastings Borough Council's blue plaque, Elsie Bowerman was a suffragette, the first woman barrister at the Old Bailey, and a survivor of the Titanic disaster. What many people don't know is that in 1916, Elsie was 26 and thrilled when she begged her mother to let her go and drive for Scottish Women's Hospitals. Dear Mother, Mrs. Haverfield has just asked me to go out to Serbia at the beginning of August to drive a car. May I go? I've been dying to go and drive a car ever since the war started. It is really a chance to go to the front. They want drivers so badly, so do say yes. It is too thrilling for words. One of the reports from the front in 1917 described the ingenuity of Scottish Women's Hospital members. In the style of Indiana Jones, Miss Brown and Miss Bowerman clambered into a moving train in Russia and saved Scottish Women's Hospital's equipment. Another account is about an ambulance driver, Olive May King, an energetic Australian woman who particularly enjoyed ice skating, tennis, surfing and motoring, including mechanics and rally driving. Just like Flora Sands. In 1915, Olive came with her ambulance called Ella to France as part of the Scottish Women's Hospitals for Foreign Service. In 1916, Olive joined the Serbian army as a driver attached to the medical headquarters at Salonika. Later, supported by funds raised by her father in Sydney, she established a string of canteens to help displaced Serbian families and soldiers. Catherine MacPhail was one of the youngest doctors who joined the first unit of Scottish Women's Hospitals in Serbia. She knew that they were sent out under the auspices of the suffrage societies, and she was relieved that the majority of the 30 women in the unit were not militant feminists. Catherine wrote, "We were extremely proud to have the opportunity to show what women could do in the most difficult circumstances, but our real aim was the urgent need to help the Serbs." The story of Mabel Dearmer, writer and illustrator, is completely different. In March 1915, busy organising the production of one of her own plays, she attended a farewell service for the 3rd Serbian Relief Unit to support a friend. Seeing several young girls at the meeting, wondered if she would let her daughter go to the front. That is, if she had daughters. Both her sons were already on the front. Then she heard her husband, Percy, then vicar of St Mary's, Primrose Hill, announced that he had just been appointed chaplain to the British units in Serbia and would soon be departing there. Mabel was 43 years old, a pacifist and a feminist, and she could not stay in London, in her cottage, tending her garden, whilst her sons and her husband went to war. She made the sudden and dramatic decision to volunteer and join Mrs. Stobart's unit. Without any medical qualifications, the only position she could take was to be an orderly, in charge of linen. Extracts from Letters from a Field Hospital by Mabel Dearmer. June 6th. I am writing in bed, although I was up part of the day as I have a touch of fever, which is responsible for my grumblings in the first part of the letter. The typhus scare is practically over, although some of the people are very ill indeed. Here is the history. The Narodnik had it first and was promptly removed. Then Inglis was taken ill, then Nurse Reed, the operation sister, then Dorothy Picton, Nurses Willis and Booth, and Miss Johnson, the manager of the laundry. The doctors said typhus, and all were removed to an isolation hospital. I felt ill. I was taken ill almost directly. I had sent my last letter to you, telling you about the typhus. But I vowed that as long as I could, I would keep on my 2 feet. I did not feel that I was in for a terrible illness, and I did not want the isolation tent. So I just made myself scarce when temperatures were taken and kept on. Then I got too bad and had to give up. And by the time this happened, the illness was beginning to mystify the doctors, as it was not continuing in the way that typhus should. And some of the patients were beginning actually to get well. Dorothy Picton was simply furious when she heard that a doubt was cast upon the authenticity of her illness. Of course, the people are painfully and miserably ill, but nothing dangerous. I simply feel hot and soppy and dissolve into tears at intervals during the day and night. My prickly heat sticks onto the blankets. Oh, for sheets. And my hair is in wet lumps, and I don't feel lovely or heroic or anything. Which just means that I'm not really ill at all. Still, it has made me quite thin, and when I stand up, I feel as if I hadn't got a stomach at all. Now you know. Dorothy is so funny out here. You see, she has taken Serbia seriously, and I don't really think that she will ever get over not having typhus and not having to rescue the wounded under heavy fire. When we saw her being carried to the typhus tent, there was a sort of silence, naturally. Now, the word typhus is greeted by shrieks of derisive laughter, in spite of the doctors assuring us that there will be lots more opportunities of dying uncomfortably. It is funny. Little groups of nurses come up to me in Percy, pathetically saying, "Well, what are we to do? We are wasting our training here on wounds 4 and 6 months old." And I always reply cheerfully, "Cholera is coming, we shall probably all get it." And they go back to their tents, quite contented and happy. The truth is that it always annoys people not to do the thing that they set out to do, whatever it is. Little Dearma died on the 11th of January, the 11th of July, I beg your pardon, 1915, in Garwood.
Thank you, Zvezda Maya. And now it's time for me to introduce our inspirational guest speaker, Colonel Nick Ilic. Now, I think everyone knows him, but for those that don't, Nick was a colonel in the British Army until his retirement this year. He graduated from the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 1991 and has served around the world on various operations and deployments. Thanks to his Yugoslav roots, he was heavily involved in the British Army's presence in Bosnia and Herzegovina between 1992 and 1999, including one tour as aide and interpreter to General Sir Michael Rose in Sarajevo in 1994. Between 2018 and 2021, he was the British Defence Attaché to Serbia, where he was responsible for the UK-Serbia defence bilateral relationship. He's a member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, a recipient of the Queen's Gallantry Medal, the Queen's Commendation for Valuable Service, the Vice Chief of Defence's Commendation, and the Serbian Red Cross Silver Medallion. He was also brave enough to act as the guide for the visit of the Scottish women to Serbia in 2015. Probably one of his most challenging assignments. So over to you, Nick.
Olga, thank you very much. It's nice to be able to stand here as a man. There's so many amazing stories, and we mustn't forget ultimately that we are a people together. And the lovely thing about this story, sad as it is, it's a story that binds two nations together. The British nation and the Serbian nation. It's a story about the Great War. It's a story about our peoples, and it's an inspirational story which sadly is largely forgotten, and therefore it's important that we keep that flame alive, because once the flame is gone, the history will also go with it. For the next 25 minutes or so, hopefully what I'll try and do is draw the whole story together, basically to illustrate why it's important that we remember. And 110 years ago, at this moment, hundreds of women were literally en route towards Serbia, in Serbia's hour of need. Serbia every year remembers their sacrifice, and sadly here in the United Kingdom it's a largely forgotten story. And then hopefully, for those of you who don't know the story, by the end of it you'll question why, and please do spread the word. And I suppose the story is largely forgotten because it's mainly about women in war. And of course in Britain in 1914, when war was declared, the role of the women was rather traditional. It was about keeping the home fires burning. It was being basically back way behind the front lines, or taking over responsibility for the work that men did who were now fighting on the front. Only on eastern battlefields, in Serbia and later in Russia, were women allowed to be what they were, and that was equal to men in many, many respects themselves. Serbia, above all, paid the largest price in the Great War, as the ambassador has already mentioned. But it was also a place where many of these women left their mortal souls in that respect. And they are to this day buried in Serbia and remain there. Dr. Elsie Inglis, as we know, was a physician, an inspirational lady of her time, part of the suffrage movement, who basically qualified as one of the early surgeons in Scotland, in Edinburgh and then in Glasgow she worked. And prior to the Great War, she was actively involved in a campaign for women's votes. And sadly, at the end of the war, despite everything they did, little changed for women in terms of their rights when they came home. And eventually, when women did get the vote, the majority of the women who travelled to Serbia still couldn't vote because they were too young. And it's a sad reflection on our society at that time. And this is where the painting by Andrea Bogdanovic is inspired from, in that respect. But when we think about women in the 1910s, this is the image that we all remember. From all walks of life, from upper, middle and working class families, but they volunteered to do their bit in that respect. The problem is that the War Office, based in Edinburgh where Elsie was at that time, when she then said to them, I can put a field hospital into the field, she was told, my good lady, go home and sit still. And of course a lady from the suffrage movement, particularly a Scot, as I well know, simply didn't take no for an answer in that respect. Undeterred, she basically raised the money. France was desperate for help, as was Belgium, and a hospital was basically raised and sent to France and operated in Roermond. Meanwhile, on the 6th of October 1914, Serbia had already been invaded twice by Austria-Hungary and needed help. And therefore, through the French government, a request arrived in London that was sent to Elsie, and she then raised further funds in order to send a hospital to Serbia, as has already basically been mentioned. The land invasion of Serbia began on the 12th of August of 1914. Austria-Hungary believed it would be a 3-month operation because Serbia was so small. But Serbia is a very proud, freedom-loving nation who had fought successfully in 2 Balkan wars, and its soldiers and population were battle-hardened, but they were still very much on their knees. Thousands suffered. The refugee crisis caused by the Austro-Hungarian advance was horrendous, and everywhere the Austro-Hungarians went, there were massacres and murders. And on the table to the side there, if those interested can find Archibald Rice's account of the atrocities in Serbia of that time itself. Images such as this, and I do apologise that you probably can't see it, appeared in the British newspapers. We all know about Belgian suffering in the Great War, but this is, if England were to be invaded, what might she suffer at the hands of the Hun? And it talks about Serbia's suffering being comparable, if not worse, to that of the Belgian people in that respect. But it wasn't only the war that was doing the killing, it was also typhus. Because of course typhus is a winter's disease. It was now winter in Serbia, and vast numbers of Austro-Hungarian prisoners were captured. They were kept in conditions that were obviously quite cramped, and that's how typhus effectively spread. But it didn't just kill the soldiers, it killed tens of thousands of civilians as well. And Serbia was in no position to support its nation in that respect. On the very day of the Austro-Hungarian invasion, on the 12th of August, Mabel Gruic, who was the American-born wife of the Serbian Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, organised the first British volunteers to go to Serbia. And they left Charing Cross Station, went across the Channel, through France, through Italy, and then across perilous waters from Italy to Greece. The likes of Emily Simmons and Flora Sands, that we've already heard of, who were not trained surgeons but had to carry out surgery in the hospital in Valjevo. If Serbia was a nation of death, at that time, Valjevo was its capital city. It was the worst place to be, but that's exactly where they went, knowing full well the risks that they would have to endure. And of course we know, and Louise has written a fantastic book about Flora Sands called A Fine Brother, or Naš Brat in Serbian. As already mentioned, not only did she win the Karađorđe Star, and there's a Karađorđe Star on that table for those interested, but she also became not only the first taxi driver in Belgrade, but also the first officer to be commissioned in the Serbian army. But Serbia needed help, and this is why these organisations such as the Serbian Relief Fund were created to raise money by Mabel Gruic and Lady Layla Paget. And of course the Scottish Women's Hospitals were raised for this purpose as well. If Britain didn't need their help, then our ally Serbia certainly did, and therefore they are by far the best known because they sent the most volunteers. And of course, as I mentioned, they were inspired by what was going on in the media. Serbia, a small nation, targeted by a much greater aggressor, was therefore, the newspapers are full of articles and vitriolic speeches about why they needed to help. And some 3,000 international volunteers went to Serbia during the course of the Great War. 1,000 of those were British, the vast majority of those were women. And about 1,000 women served in the Scottish Women's Hospitals in Serbia and in France and on other fronts as well. This is the first image of the first British field hospital, the Serbian Relief Fund, sent out by Lady Layla Paget, that was basically established in Skopje. There was 2 Serbian Relief Fund hospitals established in Skopje, which at this time wasn't suffering from conflict, but was completely overwhelmed by typhus. And Lady Paget herself caught typhus and had to come back to England in order to recuperate in that respect. But the first Scottish Women's Hospital was sent out in December, arriving in Serbia on around the 6th of January, Christmas Eve for the Serbs, led by Dr. Elena Soltau, and there they are travelling en route, and they were sent straight from Slonica to Niš, and from Niš into Kragujevac, where the army headquarters were located. And of course this is where the majority of the soldiers and refugees were now cramming the city that was overwhelmed, overpowered, and therefore typhus was rife in that respect. More and more volunteers arrived. Dr. Elsie Inglis herself, having visited France, then decided to go to Serbia herself with a second hospital led by Alice Hutchinson, and she then took over overall command of the whole Scottish Women's effort in Serbia itself. Also coming out of Evelina Hanfield and Vera Hume. Evelina Hanfield was her administrator. Women who weren't trained to be medical personnel, but they had hands-on experience in other ways, but above all, good organisers and very determined and wouldn't basically say no. And again, as you can see there, Wendy Moore has written a fantastic book that's now available both in English and now in Serbian, in hard and paperback, and I think you've got a copy here as well that people can review in that respect. There's Alice Hutchinson with the 2nd unit in Cardiff just before they departed the shores of Britain en route to Serbia. We've already heard about Mabel Stobart from Dorset. She was already a veteran of the South African Wars. She'd been in the Balkans during the 2 Balkan Wars, and now she's part of the 3rd Serbian Relief Fund hospital, travelled again to Kragujevac, the epicentre of where the military effort was basically held. And she basically established not only a hospital and a racecourse in Kragujevac, but a whole series of dispensaries in order to provide aid not only to the soldiers in Kragujevac, but the population as well. When Sir Thomas Lipton, as I'll talk about later, came to Serbia, he was shocked to see all the hospitals were full of men. Where were the women? Who was looking after the women? And this is why these dispensaries were so important, not only to cure them from all sorts of ills. Typhus couldn't be cured at this stage of the war, but they had all sorts of medical issues, in particular the children themselves. And so lo and behold, Sir Thomas Lipton was concerned and he came to help as well. But the overall medical effort was basically organised under the command of Ralph Paget, who was the ambassador in Belgrade, the husband of Lady Leila Paget, and basically an additional medical hospital established in Belgrade by Una Trubridge, who was the wife of Sir Ernest Trubridge, who commanded the British naval mission that travelled in order to support the Serbian military in the defence of Belgrade in order to neutralise the Austro-Hungarian monitor fleet that flowed up and down the Danube, and more importantly provided vital aid into the Black Sea in order to help the Ottomans in that respect. And again, a very little known story in that respect. To relieve the pressure on Kragujevac, basically 3 additional hospitals were then established at Mladenovac, Lazarevac and Valjevo. Why? Because they were right close to the front line, and therefore soldiers didn't need to travel into Kragujevac, and therefore by not travelling didn't spread typhus when they went back on leave or basically to be looked after. These were therefore the blocking hospitals ready for any subsequent operations that the Austro-Hungarians might mount in 1915 themselves. And again, all manned by women, either in buildings that were occupied for hospital purposes or in tented accommodation. And it was a glorious summer when typhus finally ended, but it came at a cost in that respect. The largest of all the hospitals was located in Vrnička Banja, where the British Red Cross under Dr. Berry established a hospital, and again their account is also available on that table there. And what's really interesting about all these hospitals is that the vast majority of the orderlies were Austro-Hungarian prisoners. Many of these were Slavs. Some were Serbs who had basically been co-opted into the Austro-Hungarian army from places like Dalmatia or Bosnia, and were only willing to help their Serbian brethren in Serbia at their greatest time of need. And again, this effort, this colossal effort, is what effectively saved in many respects the Serbian nation at that time. But it came at a cost. We've already heard about Mabel Dearmer. We've already heard about Dr. Elizabeth Ross, who only 3 weeks after arriving in Kragujevac succumbed and died of typhus on her 37th birthday on the 14th of February, Valentine's Day. She gave her life for a stranger, not a friend in that respect. But nurses like Lorna Ferris volunteered, knowing that they could well die, and to this day they remain in Serbia and are respected by the Serbian nation each year on the anniversaries of their deaths. And Louise only recently come back from Serbia, having been there last week in that respect. Who else? Louisa Jordan, a fever nurse from Glasgow, again succumbed to typhus. She looked after Elizabeth Ross. When COVID struck this country as the rest of the world, the COVID hospital in Glasgow was named after Louisa Jordan, and she, to this day, remains buried in Nice at the Jellicoe Cemetery. Who else? Madge Fraser, Scotland's most renowned amateur golfer, who represented Scotland in all tournaments right up to the war, volunteered to go out, died of typhus, is buried in Nice. And many of their graves were simply overwhelmed by the end of the war. And Isabel Emsley Hutton, after whom the Isabel Emsley Hutton Medical School in Vranja is named, when Evelina Haverfield died in March of 1920, she went back to Kragujevac to find the graves, and eventually they were all reburied in Niš, all together, less one of the Scottish Women's Hospital's victims, who to this day is in Skopje, in North Macedonia. As I mentioned, in order to bring this story to life, many people travelled to Serbia, including Sir Thomas Lipton, the great tea magnate, and he wrote this account, The Terrible Truth About Serbia, which raised thousands and thousands of pounds that allowed him, on his yachts that he would normally transport tea around the world, to put on ambulances. There were no real mechanical ambulances in Serbia. Everything was horse or oxen drawn. And therefore the Model T Fords that he took out were absolutely vital and became important, particularly on the Salonika front in 1916 onwards. And one of the quotes that he talks about in his book, where one of the ladies said, "I would gladly give my life, it would help the brave Serbians." They didn't have to leave the shores of England. Many of these women were middle upper class. They had lives, but were prepared to give them up for a small nation who were proud and fighting a much larger enemy. But it wasn't just women who went out. Clearly men went out. We've seen already Dr. Berry. But for example, the Serbian government asked the British government for help in terms of how can we stop the spread of typhus. And therefore, Dr. William Hunter, who was a British Army medical officer, went out with a team, and he effectively realised that typhus was being spread by lice. And it was being spread in uniforms, in clothes. And therefore, from that moment on, all patients were literally stripped of their clothes were destroyed, they were shaved completely naked in order to remove the threat of lice. And he also invented something that became known as a Serbian barrel, srpsko bure, which effectively wasn't about boiling clothes and washing clothes normally. It was about sterilising clothes to a temperature of 110 degrees. And that's what therefore killed the lice. And across all the front lines, Serbian barrels across all fronts where there's typhus suddenly began to appear. But fortunately, Serbia, there were so many barrels for plum brandy, there was no shortage. And slowly, typhus was brought under control, but it kept on reappearing. But the measures put in place by the British medical staff, male and female, were absolutely vital in Serbia's survival. And as we heard, in September, a month before the fourth invasion by Austria-Hungary, by Germany and now Bulgaria, a memorial fountain was built by the Morava Division in honour of Dr. Elsie Inglis and the Scottish Women's Hospitals. And that there is a service where it was blessed while Elsie was physically there herself. It must be one of the most unique memorials in the world, because you normally establish a memorial for somebody who's dead. She was still alive, they were still alive, and they were still fighting for Serbia in that respect. And that's the writing in memory of the Scottish Women's Hospital in Serbia and the founder, Dr. Elsie Inglis, in September 1915. A month later, the war reappeared, and every year on the 15th of September, the anniversary of the breakout of the Salonika front by the Serbian, the French, the Greek, the British armies, a memorial is therefore held, and we were privileged to be there in 2023 in that respect, when the painting was handed over to the ambassador. But like I mentioned, on the 6th of October 1915, the fourth invasion began. 750,000 enemy forces now advanced into Serbia on all fronts. The British and the French had sent 2 divisions from Gallipoli, but they arrived too late to actually make a difference. And they were all effectively decimated at the Battle of Kostrino in what is now North Macedonia itself. The Serbians had no option but to basically withdraw, hoping to link up with the British forces, but the route out was already cut, and therefore they had no option but to basically then fight a rearguard action and retreat over the mountains of Montenegro and Albania. So Ernest Trubridge, in order to make sure that aid was there to the bitter end, made sure that it was the British military hospital that was the last to evacuate Belgrade, and just got out in a nick of time. But many of the nurses and doctors were captured. At the same time, the British gunners who were there suppressing the Austro-Hungarian fleet were also fighting a rearguard action. And again, it came at a huge cost. Of the 103, I think it is, gunners that were there by the 1st of December, 53 had already been killed or wounded, and they then also joined the retreat over the mountains. The female hospitals, meanwhile, held until the last moment, and eventually they were then given the order to withdraw back towards Kragujevac, initially by railroad where possible, then onto oxen and carts towards Kragujevac, onto Kruševac and Vrnjačka Banja. Those who could remained with their patients, those who wanted to join the retreat over the mountains themselves. And this is where Dr. Elsie Inglis and Alice Hutchinson's hospitals were then overwhelmed by the Austro-Hungarians. They were then captured, as was the Berry Hospital in Vrnjačka Banja. And these are the women leaving on the vehicles and eventually on foot. And you'll also notice with some of the Austro-Hungarian prisoners, some 80,000 Austro-Hungarians went over the mountains. Some 30,000 Serbian boys went over the mountains. Tens of thousands were to perish. Of the 30,000 Serbian boys, only 7,000 survived that withdrawal. The future of the nation destroyed in that respect. And here we are again, some of those nurses who were captured and paraded by their Austro-Hungarian and Bulgarian captors in that respect. And again, elements of Berry Hospital. Like I said, the Serbian army had no option but to concentrate in Kosovo and Metohija. When they realised that the British weren't going to support them because they were decimated at the Battle of Kostrina and the French couldn't get to them, it was then decided to go over the mountains in the worst conditions of winter in that respect. The women tried their best to take as much of their supplies as possible. Mabel Stobart there leading her flying column, very much in support of the Serbian army over the mountains. And you can see here the line of humanity in a column following behind. It wasn't a simple withdrawal, it was a whole nation going into exile. Little did they know when they would return in that respect. And the British women who amongst them endured the worst of the conditions. Unbelievably, only one perished, but by the time they got to Scutari on the 6th of December, all were suffering terribly from frostbite and had to be repatriated back to the United Kingdom. And again, these are the sort of images that were appearing in the British media that would inspire more women to volunteer to come to Serbia's aid. Eventually, those who were captured were repatriated, they went back to England, and they simply didn't sit still. They volunteered again, and if you notice Wendy Moore's book, that's where that picture comes from in terms of Evelina Haverfield and Vera Holm. As I said, when they got back to England, they didn't sit still. Elsie began to raise more money because 2 divisions worth, some 14,000 Serbs, had been captured as part of the Austro-Hungarian forces fighting in Russia. The vast majority deserted. And therefore 2 Serbian divisions were therefore created by the Russians to fight against the Central Powers. And therefore they desperately needed medical support. So Elsie Inglis campaigned in order to send a hospital out to Russia to help those Serbs, arriving in Odessa in August of 1916, full of great hope. But of course, what was on the doorstep? The Russian Revolution, and the situation very, very quickly began to deteriorate. Of those 14,000 soldiers, 10,000 had already been killed or wounded in battle. With the revolution now raging across Russia, Elsie knew that the situation was hopeless, and she feared that these last remaining Serbs would be simply used as cannon fodder, and therefore went through a huge diplomatic hurdle in order not only to evacuate her hospitals back to the United Kingdom, but also the Serbs. And eventually she managed to do that, arriving back in Newcastle, having gone from Odessa all the way to Archangel in the north, arriving in Newcastle on the 23rd of November of 1917. When the ship docked, she put a uniform on, frail as she was, and she basically said farewell to all the doctors and nurses and all the Serbs who travelled with her, before she wrote one last note to the committee in London, and she was visited by her sisters. She was dying of cancer. She had cancer throughout this time, but refused to let it go. All these doctors and nurses had some sort of issues because of the conditions. She had not only had to live with that, but also live with cancer. And sadly, only 3 days after arriving in England, she passed away. Nobody had expected it. And the committee in London were expecting her to arrive by train to be welcomed, but sadly she never made it. And as we've heard, her funeral was effectively a state funeral. She laid in wait in St Giles in Edinburgh, and the Serbian government and the military were there to pay their respects in every regard. The last message, however, just sums up Elsie Inglis for me. Whatever happens, the Serbs must have their hospitals, because they were now on the Salonika front. They now needed additional support. The army had been rejuvenated on Corfu. Children had been sent to France and England for their education, but the hospitals were still needed in Salonika, because of course not only did they have issues with the fighting, but malaria was also rife in that respect. And therefore more and more Scottish Rite hospitals deployed to support the Serbs. And one was named after her, the Elsie Inglis unit, that paraded at Buckingham Palace before they left, and they were inspected by the King and Queen. Individuals like Lady Catherine Harvey, and there's a periodical of the war illustrated at the back of the room. The sister of Lord French, the Commander-in-Chief of British forces on the Western Front, volunteered to command the transport column. She was killed following the liberation of Monastir or Bitol in 1916, and was buried with full military honours in Thessaloniki. And again, they supported the Serbian army, often travelling in the most difficult conditions, right up against the front line, up to the heights of Kalmakchalan, up to the heights of Dobropolje with the soldiers. Far, far, far in advance of the British and French field hospitals that were located in places like Salonika themselves, in the most difficult conditions. And we heard about one of those ladies who volunteered for the driver. Can you imagine how cold it must have been in the winters in North Macedonia at that time, and how they had to endure those climatic conditions. Eventually, on the 15th September of 1918, the Great Advance from Salonika began, with the Serbian and French armies moving on the left flank and the British holding the main Bulgarian positions on the right flank. By the 30th of September, Bulgaria had been knocked out of the war. When the advancing Serbs arrived at Niš, The Berlin to Istanbul railway had been cut, effectively knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war. By this stage, Austria-Hungary had already capitulated, and Belgrade basically fell on the 1st of November of 1918. With nothing in reserve, the Germans knew that the war was lost. And therefore they too capitulated with the armistice being signed on the 11th of November. And the point is, had it not been for the efforts of the Serbs, the French, the Greeks, the Italians, the Russians on Salonika, the war would have probably carried on for a further 1 or 2 years and plans would have been made themselves. When the war ended, many of these women returned home. Many remained in Serbia. Of the remaining funds that were collected, a maternity unit was opened in Edinburgh and in Belgrade on Dedinje. The Elsie Inglis Memorial Hospital for Nurses and Children was also was open, and to this day is part of the medical complex on Dedinje in Serbia itself. Like I said right at the beginning, about 1,000 women joined the Scottish Women's Hospital. The vast majority served in Serbia, and of those, 15 died on all fronts. Her story is largely forgotten, sadly, in this country, but it's not forgotten by many in Serbia. And that's why it's important, and the work as Vezdan in particular, to keep that flame alive is so important, because it's something that we should all be proud of, that brings our two nations together. And that's why in places like Mladenovac, places like Kragujevac, and elsewhere in Banja Bašta, every year these memorials take place of a nation still 110 years later who has not forgotten and is still very, very grateful. And again, these are the latest pictures only of last week when Louise was in Kragujevac. And there she's there. Bless her. In 2015, a set of stamps were produced by the Serbian Post Office, and again, first aid covers, you can have a look there at front. And again, you know, when we commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Great War here in the United Kingdom, nothing was ever said about any front apart from the Western Front. And therefore, you know, these women that were an inspiration are an inspiration, and yet how many of our girls would benefit from knowing their stories in terms of how they can therefore aspire to be what they can be in modern days. Finally, one of the Serbian generals said when she died, in Scotland she was a doctor, in Serbia we have made her a saint. And I think that's probably something that is an epitaph to Dr. Elsie Inglis and all the women who travelled to Serbia, particularly those who gave their lives for a small, proud nation. And I think it's one way to end this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. I said he was an inspirational speaker, and he is, and I just don't know how he covers so much ground in such a short space of time. And I think Nick stressed how important this period is in showing the friendship between our two countries. And this is why I think it's so important that British Serbs and the Serbian Council and other organisations promote this thing with the memorial service that Zvezdana has done. If I can just reiterate, tomorrow, for those that are interested, there's Zadushnica, which is a memorial service at the church. In the programme it says 11:30, but we've been advised it might be closer to 11 o'clock, so I don't want you to miss it. So those of you who are coming, you might have to get up a bit earlier than you were anticipating. And after that, we're very pleased that the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, their library departments, have organised a talk by Wendy Moore about her book about Evelina Haverfield and Vera Home. So that's at 2 o'clock, and that's just around the corner from the Serbian church. There's places for 30 people, so if you're interested, please do come along. And finally, this year we're having our first Serbian film festival, and one of the films that's being shown there is a documentary which is about the retreat of the Serbian army across the Montenegrin and Albanian mountains, and it's called The Calvary of Serbia, and it's on Sunday, the 9th of March at 3:30 at the Curzon Cinema in Brunswick Centre in Bloomsbury. So, I think we're at the end of the formal part of this meeting, but Fiona just wanted to say a few words to close the meeting.
As the Lord promised of Edinburgh send us apologies, it falls to me, I'm afraid, to do what he was going to do, which was to give a very warm thank you to the Serbian Council, to the Serbian Ambassador and the Embassy here, to the family who travelled a long way to come, and to all of you who've made it here this evening. And I think it just shows that the message hasn't been lost. There are many people here supporting and promoting the memory of Elsie, Inglis, the Scottish Women's Hospitals, and all the women who served out there. And I'm sure there are many of us here today, had it been our turn, we might have gone out there. But thank you very much, Nick, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you to the Serbian Council and the Embassy. Thank you very much.
And so it just remains for me, on behalf of the Serbian Council, to say, thank you to all of you who have come this evening, especially those of you that have travelled from afar, from Scotland, from other places in Britain. Thank you especially to Elsie's descendants and Evelina Haverfield's descendants. It's great to have you here. And a special thanks to the Embassy. It's a small embassy here, and I know how hard you have to work. And so it was really, we're thankful that you could put on such a fantastic event and host it. And I won't keep you from the refreshments, because I know that that's quite a dangerous thing to do too. So thank you everyone.